institutional accessibility. So we're going to have our three presenters, and then so this one we're going to finish in about an hour. So obviously 15-minute presentations and then some time for questions. Well, let's get on. So obviously Stephen, you're first. If you want to,
Oh, I see.
okay, I will hand you the mic and hand over.
All right. Okay, so quickly, my name is Stephen. I just finished Master's in Public History at Queen's University over in Belfast. I also have an undergrad degree in Public History, which is a little bit unique, yeah, so I'm going to be talking today about a relatively short-term project I did with Northern Ireland Museums Council over the course of the winter, and yeah. So just to start, this also started the conversation for my dissertation, which is on evaluating accessibility for unseen disabilities across all Irish museums, both in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. This is a much smaller portion of that, but that's kind of where it came from. And so just to give you a couple stats, these are based on a report done by the charity Vocalize, which is a deaf charity here in the UK. It's also in collaboration with Autism in Museums and a couple other organizations. But they did two reports of a survey, one in 2018 and one in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. It may look a little bit different now, but I think the stats still speak for themselves. And the primary questions were based on accessibility. They were visitor survey of online presence for accessibility. So just to give you a few statistics, 70% of the respondents say that they look ahead before they go to a museum to find access guides, access information. And actually just 4% say that they don't do any pre-research at all. 21% said that if they don't find what they're looking for on the website, they just don't go, and they assume it's not accessible. So you're losing, a fifth of your visitors. 46% said that they showed up at some point and they found that staff were unaware of an access facility that was maybe on the website, and they found it to not be there when they arrived. 96% said they would visit more often if they found what they were looking for on the website, so just about all of them. And 82% said that while there's still improvements to be made, that their experience has improved in recent years. So there is positive news, but those are kind of like the beginning statistics. So one of the issues I've found in some of my other research is a lot of the UK museum sector, as far as any institution, is highly England-centric, which makes sense population-wise, but when you're Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, they tend to work closer together than England, because England kind of has their own things going on. And these things are going beyond physical access, so beyond wheelchair access, beyond, as part of what I talk about in my dissertation, I personally believe that those things have been reasonably well covered in several years. Of course, there's always improvements to be made, but we're talking about things that are maybe unseen. And yeah, so move on. I do want to, before I go further, just give a little disclaimer. I'm going to be talking about neurodiversity and other unseen access needs, and that I don't possess myself. And when I came into this project, that was, a concern that I had as well. Museums Council assured me that that would be okay, and I've learned a lot over the course of that. But of course, that is now and continues to be a valid criticism of anything that happens. Is that I'm not necessarily part of the community, although I'm working on these things. So just quick about the Museums Council itself. It's the lead organizational body of museums in Northern Ireland. They handle the accreditation for Northern Ireland. So the Arts Council does that in England, and the names escape me for Scotland and Wales, but anyway, they all have their own that oversee accreditation. They're impact oriented, they do projects, they collaborate really, really closely with their local museums. I don't know off the top of my head how many museums are in their network, but it is in the dozens. It's quite extensive, even for the size of Northern Ireland. And my advisor was Rachel McCann. She is no longer in this position, but she was the learning coordination officer, I believe is her position, with the Museums Council. And one of the museums that is under their care is the Northern Ireland War Memorial, which the museum space is smaller than this room. It's one room, but they have done extensive work with both dementia and autism, and I took a lot of, even though we didn't work with them for this project, we took a lot of inspiration from what they've done there. So the premise of this project itself was to improve access resources primarily for autism, although I use the term neurodiversity a lot, which it covers more than just autism. It can be any type of learning differences and how people experience museums. So while autism is the primary condition under that, I tried to make it more all-encompassing. And so the two partnerships that we established were with the Armagh Robinson Library, which is in Armagh, a small city about an hour away from Belfast, and the Irish Linen Centre, which is also the Lisburn Museum in Lisburn, which is just about 15 minutes or so away from Belfast. They had varying expectations of what they wanted from the project. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but the Armagh Robinson Library was a little bit more open-ended with what they had in mind, and the Lisburn Museum kind of had a product in mind that they sought from myself and the project. So this is the Armagh Robinson's website page for access. Of course, they've been really trying to upload stuff to their website as I talk about the report. And then we worked also with some consultation with Autism in Museums, which is really just one person, but she's based in London. So about the sites, Armagh Robinson Library is a 18th century library. Lots of antique books, primarily from the 17th and 18th century. It began by Archbishop Richard Robinson and his collections. Much like the Archbishop of Canterbury in England is the head of the Anglican Church, the Archbishop of Armagh is the head of the Church of Ireland. So Armagh is considered like the ecclesiastical capital of Ireland. It's only about 8 miles from the border, and it also is the head of the center of the Catholic Church in Ireland. So it's a perfect metaphor for Northern Ireland. So they have some unique access challenges. This is the main library room. It's very beautiful, but it is upstairs, and they do not have a lift because it is an 18th century library. They do have a chairlift, but that poses its own unique challenge. You also have to use a buzzer to get in, which is just for safety, but that's another physical barrier. So they have a few access challenges that were unique that we had to really include in the guide that came out of it. And the Irish Linen Centre Museum covers the history of Lisburn and as a center of production for Irish linen, primarily at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And they had a specific report in mind. They wanted a social story guide, which I will talk about a little bit more in the next slide. So this is what came out of it. So for the Armagh Robinson Library, we created a guide primarily for children with neurodiversity and need. They had 2 access guides because they actually have 2 sites. I focus on the Armagh Robinson Library. They also have another site which is kind of just around the corner. They didn't know what they wanted, so we came up with a children's guide because it filled a gap that they didn't have. They didn't have anything specifically for children. And children have some unique access challenges, like I said, they want to touch the books and stuff. You can't. It's an 18th century library. So it filled a gap that they wanted. Has very simple explanations, how to get in, what you're going to see. You can't touch the books, but you can do, this and that. So it has simple language, follows a lot of photos, that kind of thing. And I am happy to say that one is completed, published on their website, so you can find that on the R. Robinson Library website. They did their edits and what they wanted, so that was complete. Lisburn, on the other hand, so they wanted a social story guide. These were just my notes from my visit, and also uses photos and simple explanations. This guide really became important for me in terms of thinking about audience, because I actually, full disclosure, did not like this guide that I made, and because of that, it's kind of unfinished. We didn't really get to the end. This was only about a 3.5 month placement, so there wasn't a whole lot of time for making edits. But a social story is that it's simple statements. These are the things you'll see. These are the things you can do. I don't have a photo of that one because, like I said, it's kind of so I'm going to focus on the other one. But so these are just like the outcomes and the lessons learned. There's no expectation from visitors with these access requirements or needs for perfection. It's about putting forth effort, saying that you have these things in mind. Of course, there's always room for improvement, always room for taking their feedback. But so 2 guides were produced. One, like I said, is finished. Had really great partnerships and visits through the Museums Council and working with the sites themselves. The staff are very welcoming. There's nothing worse than being on a placement and feeling like you're not valued, and I did not have that experience at all. But I also personally got a better understanding of neurodivergence and the museum experience, how people go through, people with these needs go through museums and what their expectations are, what what their needs are, and how museums can meet those and really have a rewarding experience. I think one of the hallmarks of public history is, inclusivity, but also we don't reach full potential for history, for museum experience without everybody being involved, right? So of course, on a very basic level, examined accessibility, museums. There's all sorts of accessibility challenges. This is only one section of that. Took advice from consultations. I suppose I should have said this earlier, but we did consult with an adult living with autism who also works at the Ulster Museum in Belfast, which is one of the National Museum's Northern Ireland sites. And so he kind of had 2 experiences, both needing some of those access things, but also working in a museum. So it was a perfect consultant for us, and took his feedback. And we're also keenly aware that it's only one person's experience, but still very helpful nonetheless. And like I said, the importance of audience. So this is like the link on their website for the guide. The one that was on the last slide is kind of below this. They did a little write-up. And maybe someday we can return to the Lisburn Museum guide. We'll see. But just real fast at the end here, this project really highlighted collaboration. It would not have been possible without all of these people. Rachel is from Museums Council. Michael was our consultant. Carol and Stephen are from the R. Robinson Library. Emma's from Lisburn Museum. Claire is the founder and really sole organizer of autism in museums. She does some amazing work. And Leonie and Olin are both from Queens. So with that, I'll see if I have, I guess just to wrap up. So it really also, you find out what works and what doesn't work. And so sometimes, things like the Lisburn Museum that don't go as well, that in and of itself is a learning experience, and what can be improved. Sometimes things just don't work, and that's okay. So it's just about finding, the right way forward for all these things. So anyway, I will wrap up with that.
Thank you. That was brilliant. That was really well done. We now have Elysia to come up. You don't have a PowerPoint, do you?
No.
Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, you're going to come and talk about. I'll let you introduce.
So this is about some recent placement work that I've done with Glastonbury Abbey, trying to sort of convince people, I guess, that the Middle Ages are sort of interesting, relevant, and that they do have lessons that we can learn from today. In 2020, the University of Bristol's Special Collections acquired a single-leaf manuscript cut from a 13th century Vulgate Bible, produced at Glastonbury Abbey between 1225 to 1250. The Bible remained in the Abbey's collections until its dissolution in 1539. With only one brief period of known ownership over the next 450 years, the Bible remained largely unaccounted for until it resurfaced in Sotheby's auction house in 1982. There, it was purchased by the controversial art and manuscript dealer Bruce Farini, notorious for his traffic in forgeries and looted artefacts, and for embezzling funds from his clients. Farini's treatment of our Bible was not nearly so deleterious as his alleged handling of a rare notebook of Leonardo da Vinci's that he was holding for a client and then promptly lost, or of the 1800-year-old Gospel of Judas that he left to deteriorate in a fridge for 16 years. But like so many other codexes acquired by Farini, it was dismantled to be sold, leaf by leaf, reflecting the irreverence and commodification that characterised the treatment of manuscripts and the landscape of private manuscript dealing in the late 20th century. The bulk of these disparate leaves was subsequently acquired by the Shoin collection, itself linked to looting, the destruction of heritage sites, and even the Taliban and other terrorist organisations. Happily, the reconstructed Bible that had been gathered up by the collection soon passed into the hands of Oslo Cathedral School, an altogether more peaceful location where it remains today. 2 further leaves were purchased by the Cleveland Museum of Art in Ohio, and after another gap in its known history, the leaf at the centre of this project ended up in Bristol University. Having experienced such an eventful journey, it is quite remarkable that it survives in the near pristine condition in which we find it today. While the biblical text it bears, from the Book of 1 Chronicles, is perhaps one of the least interesting parts of the Bible, its artistic and historical significance as an example of fine craftsmanship from the only Bible to survive from one of England's most important religious houses renders this a truly remarkable artefact to work with, as I've been fortunate to do during the placement component of my MA programme. When tasked with creating a small exhibition at Glastonbury Abbey to surround the leaf, along with online resources and a series of events to supplement and support the displays, I was given a reasonable degree of free rein to decide how I wanted it to be presented and contextualised. I chose to use the leaf as a vehicle to explore the intellectual and artistic life of ecclesiastical institutions in the Middle Ages, a theme which, even I have to admit, does sound a little bland at first glance, and it was certainly greeted with a little scepticism when first proposed as a topic intended to inspire and pique the interest of the general public. Yet this theme also has the potential to bridge a number of divides and foster a spirit of connection in a multitude of forms, the idea that we will discuss forthwith and to which this paper is principally dedicated. When we think about the Middle Ages, particularly in Britain, it can be easy to focus upon examples of the deep divisions that seem to characterise the epoch, like the rifts between kings that dragged their subjects into expensive, brutal wars, the tensions between religions that erupted into the Crusade movement that still has troubling implications for global security today, differences between native subjects and conquering settlers, between men and women and the fabulously wealthy and the cripplingly poor. With all of these divisions in mind, it can be challenging to think of Britain and the broader medieval world as anything other than fractured, even fairly bleak. Phrases such as mindless violence, so frequently applied to the period, fail to recognise the political imperatives and careful strategy at the heart of so many medieval conflicts. Violent, yes, but certainly not mindless, and often conducted with chilling rationality. Equally, even the word medieval itself, when used to refer to modern events that are perceived to be backward and out of step with our values, creates an impression of the age as one of stagnation, cultural and intellectual darkness, formed and driven by barbarous, uncivilized, and even stupid people. There is no denying that there are elements of truth to some of these views. They are easy tropes into which to play in contemporary cultural depictions of the Middle Ages, and resultantly have had a profound and formative impression upon the broader public consciousness of the period. Alarmingly, and to my frustration, I've even observed scholars of other periods espouse these ways of thinking, either out of a lack of familiarity, or, perhaps more sinisterly, to emphasise the more attractive elements of their period of study. These are, however, some of the most important impressions about the medieval world that I have sought to encourage visitors to re-examine, and discussions to which I have hoped I could add more nuance throughout the project. It became clear that the most effective way to challenge such vast conceptual notions of what medieval life and learning was actually like was to acquaint visitors with the real people and real human stories at the centre of these issues. It is only by identifying with medieval people directly, recognising elements of their life and world that closely mirror ours today, and beginning to feel a sense of connection to our medieval forebears, that a more sensitive, respectful and accurate understanding of the period can be achieved. While the contemporary events and circumstances that shaped the lives of the monastic community at Glastonbury were clearly vastly different to our own, the issues at the heart of these events strongly resemble concerns that we still share. Let us take, as just one example, the issues of independence, sovereignty and the right to self-determination, themes that continue to dominate our news cycle and cause dissension to this day. The scriptorium at Glastonbury was primarily dedicated to the copying of texts, and the place in which these works would be richly illuminated. Yet, in researching further into the products of Glastonbury scriptorium, I stumbled across a host of forged charters and political texts riddled with blatant mistruths that the monks of the abbey had falsified in the late 12th century to prove their historic independence from the See of Bath. So opposed were they to their imminent annexation into the bishopric that the monks campaigned directly to Richard I and Pope Celestine III, followed by Innocent III, sending multiple delegations to Rome to air their discontent more forcefully. These events would prove so central to the abbey's sense of self-identity that they even held a dominant place in later 15th century chronicles of the abbey's history. The formulaic and dense language of most medieval charters and the complex political imperatives that accompanied Glastonbury's struggle for independence can be quite unapproachable and even slightly dulled for public and non-specialist consumption, but by presenting these documents and the broader political discourse of which they form a part, at the heart of the deeply personal struggle for the community's rights and autonomy, visitors have enjoyed a sense of connection and found a surprising but deeply compelling link with a group that can otherwise seem remote and far removed. Visitors who have approached the themes of the project with the notion of the severity of monastic way of life in mind have been surprised and amused by the idea of monks who had dedicated their lives to God, vowing to practice their faith honestly and honourably, creating this profusion of falsified documentation and brazenly lying to the highest political and spiritual authorities in order to maintain their independence. Yet, visitors have also been deeply moved by instances in which this desire for self-determination has reached a more tragic conclusion. In 1077, the community had the first Norman abbot, Thurston, imposed upon them after the conquest, who sought to radically alter the monks' way of life and the liturgy practiced at Glastonbury, while the vast riches held by the pre-conquest abbey were confiscated by the Norman invaders. When the community demurred, their objections were brutally suppressed. Thurston brought in troops to quell their insurrection, resulting in many serious injuries and even the deaths of several of the monks in his charge. While the project hasn't necessarily sought to provide an overt comparative interpretation of the issues raised, we cannot fail to recognise elements of the monks' struggle in so many other historical periods that have been characterised by plunder, suppression of native culture, and egregious violence wrought against dissenting voices. In general, then, I hope I've encouraged visitors to perhaps reconsider how we regard and discuss the people that inhabited the medieval world. Given that so many centuries separate us, it is easy to think of ourselves as distinct and even superior to those that came before, but in closely acquainting ourselves with individuals or specific communities, it thus becomes clear that we're really not that different. Another aspect of connection that I hope visitors would consider is what, for a predominantly Anglo-centric audience, constitutes our heritage. The traditional impression, discussed previously, of the divisions that carve the medieval world can be dismantled when we explore the processes of intellectual and cultural exchange occurring between Britain, Europe, and even into Africa and the East. The technique used to illuminate and decorate the fragment at the centre of this project, for example, finds its roots in Egypt, while gum arabic, one of the most common ingredients in medieval inks used to copy this and many other manuscripts, is grown in the savannas of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Sudan. The issues that often come with lifting from other cultures are obvious, and it cannot be claimed that these intercultural contacts were universally positive, but there are also innumerable instances of mutually respectful exchanges taking place all throughout the period. I hope to demonstrate in the project that traditions which we might think of as traditionally Western, British, or English were instead often imported, adopted, and developed upon, thanks to the intellectual curiosity and artistic ingenuity of our medieval ancestors. For example, the troubadours and trouvères made some of the most significant contributions to Western music and poetry, with their art even inspiring new modes of behaviour and codes of social interaction that pervaded courts across Europe. Their craft has continued to influence Western classical music and literature through the centuries, and in many ways the tradition feels almost indivisible from a European courtly setting. Yet a much-needed reassessment has taken place in recent decades, and the tradition has emerged as a product of close observation by European artists of Islamic melodies, lyrics, and rhetoric during the Crusades. Equally, instruments that have been so central to Western classical music, such as the lute, harp, and violin, were imported during the Middle Ages from Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, while at Glastonbury itself, archaeologists have found instruments originating from as far away as China. Similarly, notable abbots of Glastonbury, such as Henry of Blois, sought to keep the house at the forefront of intellectual life, maintaining an awareness of scholarly developments from across the known world. He corresponded with notable figures such as Peter the Venerable, Abbot of Cluny, who sought to radically improve Christian understanding and subsequently Western relations with the Islamic faith, and Henry was very likely in possession of Peter's translation of the Quran into Latin. Additionally, in scouring the inventory of Glastonbury's library, recorded between 1247 to 1248, I found reference to a 10th century copy of a rare 6th century text by the fairly obscure North African theologian Fulgentius Ferrandus. The vast geographical spread of the Abbey's collections, as well as its impressive depth in holding lesser-known but theologically rich texts such as this, should prompt a thorough reconsideration of our idea of a medieval past defined largely by its hostile and segregated nature. It could certainly be argued that absorbing the scholarly wisdom and crafts of other cultures so firmly into our own, to the point of them being perceived in the modern day as Western traditions, while forgetting their roots, carries troubling proto-colonialist overtones. Yet this fails to recognise the genuine respect and admiration with which medieval artists and scholars from the West treated their counterparts. Despite the violent crusading context in which many of these contacts took place, there is strong evidence that medieval peoples sought to establish a rapport and even friendship with members of other cultures and ethnic groups. Sorry, I completely lost my place. Through a reciprocally deferential exchange of traditions, and so to interpret the adoption of non-Western traditions through the lens of our modern aversion to cultural appropriation would be a misguided way of understanding the medieval approach to art and knowledge. I've sought to demonstrate to visitors that the assessment of the Middle Ages as fractured, divided, and isolated is difficult to maintain when we consider the vibrancy and significance of the connections and contacts being forged. Intercultural violence and antipathy were pervasive, unquestionably so, but they were also offset by the efforts of so many artists and scholars to come to a greater and more peaceful understanding. Even more significantly, when considering relations with other countries and cultures in the modern day, we should also reflect upon the fact that while there is much that still divides us, so much of our history and heritage is shared and inextricably intertwined. I hope that the examples presented in the project of the often overlooked unity and harmony of the medieval world have struck visitors and provided a valuable perspective upon which to build in their own efforts to connect respectfully with converse cultures. This leads us to the final point of connection that has emerged throughout the project, between the countless individuals and organisations that contribute to a successful exhibition and the delivery of a beneficial and highly informative but still thoroughly enjoyable public experience. Beyond my placement, my MA programme is almost solely theoretically and research-based, and in general I have very few opportunities to bring my work into a public forum. As a result, my research tends to benefit from an invaluable but limited range of perspectives. This project, however, has brought these predominantly academic voices into a productive and fascinating dialogue with librarians, archivists, curators, conservators, and even public engagement and outreach officers, all sharing the wealth of their collective experience and expertise in order to offer the public the most nuanced and informed interpretation of the project's themes. While the importance of this collaborative approach is becoming increasingly recognised, old hostilities between academic and public-facing historians continue to linger, and so the significance of a project such as this, that helps to bridge this gap, cannot be overstated. Equally, it is crucial to bring history as a discipline into a more relevant, engaging, and accessible position. Regrettably, with interest in history declining among students and the public at large, history and historians must justify their necessity and value. It thus becomes clear that research cannot be confined to the comparatively select group of scholars that it interests, and must instead be brought before the public, both for their enjoyment, but also to allow new scholarship to hold up to the scrutiny of changing moral values, and even make a practical contribution to these debates. The ideas discussed above of our shared global heritage, for instance, have the potential to impact upon intercultural and international relations today, and the public should be encouraged to consider how they apply to their own lives. It is therefore apparent that conclusions of a sensitive nature, generated by vigorous academic research, should be put into the hands of heritage professionals who can help the public gain the greatest benefit from them. Individually, the work of all of the practitioners involved are important, but but when combined, the reading and presentation of history this collaboration creates is essential. I'm under absolutely no illusion that my very small exhibition can decisively rectify the public misconception of the Middle Ages. Violence and division are ideas too powerful and too profitable for modern depictions of the medieval to relinquish, and these misapprehensions will continue to be perpetuated. Thus, many will likely continue to think of the period as one too far removed from our own to bear much relevance, and from which few lessons can be learned. Yet, if even one visitor emerges feeling more engaged with and connected to their medieval heritage than before, then I shall consider the aims of the project happily achieved.
Thank you very much, that was really good. So we now have Amy, so on the quantitative analysis of, I'll let you introduce, I'll let you do that bit, but there you go. Yeah,
Thank you. So I'm going to talk today about some initial quantitative findings of my ongoing PhD research that has investigated the impact of engaging with varied heritage and historical sites across England on individuals' wellbeing. My project hoped to establish the role that heritage sites can play in wider socio-political goals of improving wellbeing and contribute to current conversations regarding the public history and heritage sector's impact on visitor wellbeing, which to date have largely focused on museums and archaeology sites. This research hoped to understand what specific visitor wellbeing attributes engagement with heritage sites positively or negatively altered, and sought to use this as evidence to and as a tool to support public historians, heritage professionals and organisations' engagement strategies. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about what is wellbeing. I'm aware it's a concept that we maybe don't come across that often in public history, so this is just a little bit of context, so when I refer to wellbeing, you know what I'm talking about. So the concept of wellbeing is complex and it is socially constructed. It's often defined as happiness, observable, measurable, and in recent years has been linked to both physical and mental health. So for example, in 1948, the World Health Organization stated that health is a state of complex physical, mental and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease. There are various factors which impact well-being, including income, work, education, health, relationships, loneliness, and the environment. And well-being can be impacted by external conditions, and is generally measured by 4 categories: quality of life, life satisfaction, subjective well-being and happiness. The New Economics Foundation suggests that personal well-being comprises 2 main elements: feeling good and functioning well. So feelings of happiness, contentment, enjoyment, curiosity and engagement are characteristics often associated with someone who has a positive experience of their life. Equally important for well-being is our functioning in the world around us. So experiencing positive relationships, having control over your life, having a sense of purpose are all important attributes of well-being. And it's been suggested that a person could be deemed to have positive well-being if they have a positive perception of themselves and the surrounding environment. The National Accounts Framework of Wellbeing, which is up on there, suggests that it breaks attributes of wellbeing down into more detail. And this is based on a European survey of around 20,000 people and what people thought were important for themselves personally. So this is sort of the collation of that data. And it suggests that personal well-being is made up of 5 main components. So we have emotional well-being, vitality, positive functioning, resilience and self-esteem, and satisfying life. And social well-being has 2 main components: supportive relationships and trust and belonging. The New Economics Foundation also discussed the 5 ways to well-being, and if you've seen any sort of NHS things about well-being, this is what the NHS use to promote well-being as well. But it suggests there's 5 steps that individuals can take to improve their mental health and well-being. So those are to connect, sort of people around you, family, friends, colleagues, neighbours, to be active, so to go for a walk or a run, playing a game, going in the garden, exercising, taking notice, so being curious about the world around you and engaging in that, keep learning, so trying something new, not necessarily academic, but also academic, and contributing, so to give, so doing something nice for other people potentially, not just monetarily. And wellbeing has become a central theme in political discussions and is at the epicentre of many public policies and policy documents, including those relating to heritage. Wellbeing, lowering wellbeing inequity and reducing wellness poverty is a political priority for many international and national organisations and governments, and global and inter-organisational focus on wellbeing has resulted in wellbeing connected to lots of international policies, including health, security, sustainability, reduction of poverty and education. Public history and heritage has been shown to improve wellbeing. So the benefits of engaging with public history and heritage to individual subjective wellbeing are increasingly forming part of government, academic and professional research. And evidence indicates that public history at heritage sites can improve wellbeing by facilitating being active, building confidence and team working, facilitating learning, forming relationships, making friends and breaking down barriers, reducing antisocial behaviours, improving communication skills, developing a sense of ownership and belonging, and developing a sense of community. As such, public history's impact on wellbeing can be linked to a range of social, economic and environmental sustainable development agendas and global sustainable development goals, including United Nations 2033 Sustainable Development Agendas and UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals. To date, most research investigating the wellbeing impact of engaging with heritage is focused on museums and archaeology, and increasingly social prescribing programmes or interventions. Much of this research has focused solely on emotional wellbeing. It was these instances and circumstances that inspired this research. So this research sought to take a more holistic approach, investigating the impact of engaging with heritage on all aspects of individuals' wellbeing, specifically those linked to the wellbeing frameworks and 5 ways to wellbeing I just discussed, and considering an area of the sector which is under-researched, so heritage sites. So this research investigated the wellbeing impact of visiting 5 case study managed heritage sites. So we have Elizabeth Gaskell's house in Manchester, Merchant Adventurers Hall in York, Lyme in Stockport, Audley End in Essex, and Delaprey Abbey in Northampton. Sites were selected because they varied on key characteristics, including range of time periods, type of interpretation, management types, location, and the socio-economic demographics of the surrounding area. The differentiation of these key characteristics hopes to ensure that the sites provided a range of heritage and contexts and would therefore be widely applicable to the heritage sector as a whole. The wellbeing impact of visiting these sites was investigated by a mixed method, multidisciplinary and multi-phase empirical approach to social value data collection and analysis, incorporating published and piloted industry standard measures for quantitative and qualitative data capture and analysis of change to wellbeing, such as the Modified Wellbeing Survey, which is on the right of the screen there, and the Positive and Negative Effect Schedule. So the Modified Wellbeing Survey integrates questions from psychologically accredited surveys for measuring wellbeing, including the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, and questions that incorporate those framework indicators that I mentioned earlier. The Positive and Negative Effect Schedule is a public health care accredited measure which is specifically developed to identify change in wellbeing through positive and negative emotions, measured through scoring positive and negative words on, in this case, on a 5-point scale. So we asked visitors to complete a survey which included both of these scales and some demographic and qualitative questions before and after their visits. This approach to investigating the impact of the heritage site on visitors' wellbeing regarded engaging with heritage sites as an ethnographic process in which people's experience of heritage can influence and impact their lives. Individuals before and after surveys were then paired to enable measurement of change. Individuals who didn't complete both surveys were withdrawn from the dataset. Change between before and after mean averages were calculated and statistical hypothesis testing conducted. Non-parametric related sample tests tested the significance of quantitative results and the probability that any change to wellbeing was not a result of chance, and showed a true reflection of change in the population. Results were deemed to be statistically significant when tests returned a p-value below 0.05 and highly significant below 0.01. And the two-tailed test was conducted to test for change to wellbeing rather than solely improvement or reduction. And the direction of change was determined by the greater number of positive or negative differences in the matched pairs. So, my participants. Between October 21 and March 2022, 445 people visited one of the case study heritage sites and completed both the before and after surveys. Participants had a mean average age of 51, were predominantly female, did not consider themselves to have a disability, identified as white, and were visiting for a family day out. Mean PANAS negative scores reduced by an average of 6.29%, and all negative emotions measured were reduced after visiting the heritage site. Irritable reduced the most, with a reduction of 17.26%, and reductions in irritable, jittery, nervous, afraid, distressed and guilty were highly statistically significant, and a reduction to scared was significant. Overall, mean positive PANAS scores increased by 10.7%, and all positive PANAS emotions increased after visiting a heritage site. Inspired increased the most by 22.76%, and all of the positive emotions measured were highly statistically significant. The modified wellbeing score has increased by 4.57% across all measures, and all measures again increased, with a sense of accomplishment increasing the most by 8.36%. Increases in feeling my life is worthwhile were statistically significant, and all other measures were highly statistically significant. These quantitative results indicated that visiting heritage sites supported 5 ways to wellbeing: to connect, to keep learning, to be active and take notice. Visiting impacted all of the national economic framework, personal and social wellbeing components. Both social wellbeing components, trust and belonging, and supportive relationships were impacted, with visitors feeling improvements in being able to trust people, people support each other, connected to the local environment and belonging to a neighbourhood. Personal wellbeing components were improved as well. Positive function increased, with visitors feeling an increased engagement. They were more interested in the world around them and inspired. More competent, so increased feelings of a sense of accomplishment. Meaning and purpose, having the opportunity to learn new things. And autonomy, increased feelings of having freedom of choice. Emotional wellbeing improved, with increased feelings of strong, proud, excited, enthusiastic, determined, alert and attentive, and participants were less irritable, jittery, nervous, afraid, distressed, guilty and scared. Satisfying life also increased, with visitors reporting increase in feeling happy and satisfied with their lives, as did vitality, with participants feeling more physically active after visiting. Resilience and self-esteem improved, with visitors feeling more able to overcome challenges and more optimistic about their future. Statistical analysis also conducted on the data at each site individually. This revealed that 7 measures were statistically significant at every single site when the data was separated by site visit. Feeling optimistic about my future, satisfied with my life, alert, attentive, excited and inspired underwent statistically significant increases at every site, and irritable decreased significantly at all sites as well. This suggests that all heritage sites may be able to impact visitors' wellbeing in the components of life satisfaction, vitality, positive functioning and emotional wellbeing. The initial results of this research showed that visiting heritage sites impacted visitor wellbeing, demonstrating that engaging with heritage can impact multiple components of wellbeing. Next steps for this project include thematic analysis of qualitative responses to questions, such as do you feel that visiting impacted your wellbeing, and triangulation of quantitative and qualitative results, alongside investigating if there is a differential wellbeing impact on different diverse groups of participants, including different age groups, genders, ethnicities, proximity to site, frequency of visit, and reason for visiting. This further analysis will enable an understanding of the role that heritage sites may be able to play in supporting and tackling wellbeing inequality, and offers insight to support heritage sites to better support visitor and wider community wellbeing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that was brilliant. Sorry. So we'll now open it up for questions. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone wants to start.
Thank you for that. My question is just for the last presentation that went. I was quite struck about with the data that it was 94% white. I live in Northampton as well, so I'm quite close to Dunbury Abbey, and I know a lot of the people that go there are predominantly white British. But I also know part of that building was made from money generated through colonialism and enslavement as well. Do you think, due to those sorts of connotations of those buildings, that your data could be biased due to how the demographics that attend those places are from a white British background in that regard?
Yeah.
And how do you talk about that in a PhD?
I think.
Oh,
sorry.
Thank
you. I think it's a really good question, and so at the start of the PhD, one of the things that I really wanted to look at was this differential impact on different groups, different demographics, and I mean, I think it's quite well known that the demographics that visit heritage sites typically in the UK aren't necessarily representative of UK demographics, and so I sort of knew that that was going to be a challenge going in. I think it's just a limitation of the study that I wasn't able to survey more people. I think my study design is quite demanding in some respects, in that I ask people to do a survey before and after they visit, and obviously that takes a bit of time and not everyone wants to do that. So I think the participants that I ended up with are reflective of a certain demographic, so it tended to be sort of older people who retired, who had more time. I didn't get that many people who were there with young families who wanted to participate, because obviously they've got children to look after and things, and they don't want to be spending 5 minutes at the start and end doing a survey. So absolutely it is a sort of limitation of the study, and I think that there could be different outcomes if I'd been able to get a broader, more diverse.
I was just thinking post 2020 as well, Black Lives Matter and stuff that's going on, and Professor Corinne Fowler and colleagues wrote that huge document on the National Trust heritage sites being built. I think it was 29 properties across the country have some link to colonialism and slavery. So when black and brown people visit those places, their wellness might be a lot different to when white British people go and visit those places. So
Yeah.
it'd be interesting if the data would say if there was more diverse demographics.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to do a study on that, essentially, the wellbeing impact of difficult heritage. So yeah, I hope that sort of answers your question.
Do you have any other? Oh.
Yeah, my question was for Amy as well. I think I've had a look at this stuff in my MA as well, and had a look at these different measures. In just, say, talking personally, what do you think about these indexes and measures that are available and are being used internationally? It seems like they work quite well for sort of a healthcare setting, like you were saying. What do you personally think about? I can see that you've used them because you want to be able to index it against other governments and people and say this proves that on your wellbeing measure heritage makes a difference. But what do you personally think about the questionnaires that you're almost like forced to use for it? Do you think you would be sorry, you could
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I find your word almost forced to use interesting there, the word forced, because obviously the ethics of doing any kind of research into sort of mental health and wellbeing are very tightly controlled in some ways, and so you are in essence forced to use sort of standardised surveys, which I think can limit your understanding of the impact of heritage sites in particular, because I think they're a very unique context, and I think what people get out of visiting heritage sites is very different for everybody. So I've sort of tried to combat that a little bit. I haven't been able to discuss it in this presentation just due to time, but with qualitative questions and asking people and having conversations with people, like, do you think that this impacted your well-being? And there's been an interesting sort of dichotomy, I suppose, in people saying, no, I don't think this has impacted my well-being, but then listing things that are associated with well-being, that they have enjoyed it and they found it interesting, and they've learned something new, which are all factors which, according to the literature, do impact our well-being. So I think there's potentially this sort of public dichotomy in what the public understand well-being to be as well. So I think the scales can be they're very clinical, like you say, they work in healthcare settings, and they can be a bit off-putting to people. So I think in an ideal world it'd be great to have some kind of scale that was contextualised to heritage sites in particular. But like you say, I've tried to sort of benchmark heritage sites against other cultural institutions as well.
That's brilliant.
Thank you.
Do you have any more? Yeah. Sorry, I'll come to you afterwards.
Thank you everyone, that was such an interesting panel, and I think as someone who works in museums at the moment, accessibility is usually on the brain of what we're doing. And my question, I suppose, is directed more to Stephen here, but I think it touches on what Amy was saying as well about the work that you do and what we have. And I commend you, Stephen, for trying to do this work as well. I think, as you said, being someone who's neuronormative and looking at neurodivergency can be difficult, and you do get questioned. I would love you to maybe talk a little bit more about that as well, but that's not the point I'm coming to. I wonder, having done this project, do you think that this is something that smaller institutions or even just kind of solo institutions should be doing themselves, or is this something that we need to actually develop as a national policy, things that we can then roll out and do expect of the heritage sector to be able to provide? Or is it maybe something that we could get consultancy firms in to do something like that? I'd just love to know your thoughts on, now you've been in it, now you've done it, is it a worthwhile process, or is this something that is a much bigger beast, given that this is about social justice and equity?
Oh no, she walked into my trap.
Okay, so funny you say that. So a large section of my dissertation is comparing, now primarily in Ireland, but you know, it can go for anywhere. Small institutions, you know, small, more localized museums with, I say large museums, but my definition of large museums, at least for the purposes of the research, was national museums, both Northern Ireland and Ireland. I think the short answer of should smaller museums be doing this is yes, although you know, certainly there are limitations to that. I think you know, small museums are limited by staff, by funding, you know, those types of things. But part of what I argue is that, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be. It's twofold. It doesn't have to be difficult. You can do very simple things. It doesn't have to be time consuming. And it also doesn't have to be perfect. You know, there is not an expectation from people who are looking for these resources that everyone's going to be an expert, you know, in whatever their particular need is, and a museum is not necessarily going to be able to cater to them on a personal level. However, there is an expectation that there will be some level of inclusivity, you know, and on a basic level able to experience the site more or less in the same way that, you know, you and I would be able to. if I could just have you repeat the second half of the question, is that?
Well, just whether this is something that is a bigger policy problem.
Right. Yes. Again, another thing to talk about is so at least in Ireland, it's kind of interesting. The accreditation standards. I actually found that the Northern Ireland ones, which fall under the UK ones, are much more sophisticated than the Republic is. And I thought that was very interesting, and a lot of that has to do with time. So the UK standards have been around for a fair amount of time, and actually, this might shock everybody in the room, they're actually pretty good. I know we like to focus on shortcomings, but I actually think they're quite good, and they do have accessibility language in them. You know, museums in the UK have to have a certain level of access things online. They have to have certain things in place. You know, certainly there's room for improvement on any site level. However, in Ireland, they do not have to have any, at least for accreditation, they do not have to meet any access requirements. And that is, they're hoping to add that, but it is because it is such a new scheme that they're just trying to get museums accredited, basically, before they do that. And so that leaves sites not prioritizing that, because if they don't need it to get their accreditation, then they're maybe not focusing on it. So I don't know, does that answer your question, I guess? So yeah, on an institutional level, I don't know the question, how to answer the question of should it be a rollout, on a political level, whatever. I think every site is different, but I do think requiring museums to have various access language, to gain accreditation, seems fairly basic, I would think, at least at this point. So.
Thank you.
Right. I think we've got time for one more question. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Partly answered, but thank you.
Thank you. My question is also to Stephen. I was thinking about the guides that you worked on specifically for the exhibitions in those museums. I was thinking about when, on top of that, when you have, say, temporary exhibitions coming or exhibitions that are externally curated, do you get a sense that the framework that you established would then still be used in those situations? I'm also thinking about situations where I've come across from museums I worked in where if it's a led activity as well, that a group of people are doing, and maybe some are neurodiverse, how do you then ensure that the material for the neurodiverse people is integrated sort of seamlessly? Because quite often it's something else that they're given which doesn't have any bearing on what you're doing. So then the question is, how can you be sure that the work that you've done then continues in all different areas of museum engagement?
So I'm going to answer the second part first. Access stuff should theoretically be throughout the framework from the beginning instead of backtracking, right? So a lot of museums have their site, have their exhibitions, have their what, and then they try to go back and put in guides or put in, that's kind of what I did on this project. In an ideal world, as you're putting together a new exhibition or a traveling exhibition, you have those things in mind beforehand. And so as you're putting together an exhibition, you say, are we meeting the needs of a wide range of people through this? So I think the idea of temporary exhibitions is really interesting because, of course, the reality is these things do take time and they do take effort. So, having things in place for every thing that comes through. But again, I think it goes back to simplicity. You don't have to. I don't know if there's any other Americans in the room, but the U.S. Navy has a motto or a slogan, basically, is keep it simple, stupid, right? And so if it's good enough for the military, it can be good enough for us. Keep it simple. It doesn't have to be you don't have to overthink these things. And of course, you can continue to improve as time goes on, but there doesn't, I think we as, closer to academics, most of us, want to cover all our bases immediately, and just as long as you're putting forth the effort, that is received positively for the vast majority of people, I'd say. So I'm hoping I'm answering people's questions.
I'm just going to very quickly make time. Thomas Caban wasn't here for your presentation, but he left. But he's since tweeted a question. So I'm just going to read out his question very briefly. He's asked how your accessibility reports could, brackets or not, change how history is presented in the museum and library.
I'm sorry, can you repeat it?
Yeah. So just how your accessibility reports could, or maybe not, change how the history is then presented in those museums and the library. I'm sure you could probably have a conversation with him downstairs at some point.
Yeah, we've talked. I'm not really sure how I answer this. It'd be easier to see. Can I see it written? I'm sorry.
I'm sure you probably have this conversation.
Reports could or could not change how his. Yeah, so what you don't want to do in a report or a guide is just repeat everything that they're seeing in the exhibit. It's a way to experience the exhibit. So a lot of them, at least the ones that I've seen and I've made, are very simplistic, and they're not to be a replacement for seeing the exhibition. If you just read the guides that are on the website that I spoke about, you wouldn't necessarily learn anything unless you go to the site. It's literally that, a guide through the space. So as far as how it changes the way we do exhibitions, I'm not really sure, but I think it goes back to your question about having those things in mind before you go forward. So it's natural that museums that have been around for a long time are going back and doing these things, but any site that's doing something new, I would hope, is having access needs and requirements in mind before they move forward with a site from the beginning.
Yeah.
Thomas isn't here, so I can't ask him if I answered his question.
That's brilliant, thank you. So that is the end of this session. So we have a few minutes until the next one starts. I just want to remind you all, your programmes are now slightly incorrect. So the community co-production is now going to be in here rather than the visual media, and visual media vice versa will be downstairs. So if you want to shuffle around, you're welcome to do so. That will start in just less than 15 minutes, so you've got a bit of time to figure out what you want to do and make your way and all that. But I think just one more round of applause for our